Clara Zhang arrived in Wyoming territory with nothing but hope in her heart and a promise of marriage. But one by one, potential husbands turned her away. Too quiet, they said. How can a woman who barely speaks run a frontier household? What they saw as a flaw, one man saw as something else entirely. James McKinnon had been deaf since birth, yet he'd built one of the most successful ranches in the territory. When he first met Clara, he noticed something the others had missed. The way her hands danced when she moved, the poetry in her gestures, the stories written in her eyes. In a world obsessed with noise, he recognized her silence for what it truly was, a song waiting to be discovered. But could a woman who'd learned to hide her true self trust a man who saw her most carefully guarded secret? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach rattled to a stop before Thornwood's only hotel, kicking up clouds of Wyoming dust that sparkled gold in the late afternoon sun. Clara Zhang's fingers instinctively found the jade hairpin tucked securely in her twist of black hair. Her mother's final gift, pressed into her palm the morning she left Shanghai. For luck, she had whispered, and to remember who you are. Now, 3 months and an ocean later, Clara stood alone on Thornwood's main street, clutching a carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. Her dark eyes took in the bustling frontier town, the general store with its weather-worn sign, the smithy ringing with the rhythm of hammer on anvil, the saloon where raucous laughter spilled onto the street along with the piano's tinny melody. A clump of town women paused their gossip to stare, their curious gazes making Clara's skin prickle beneath her travel-worn dress. She lowered her eyes, fighting the urge to touch her hairpin again. Instead, she pulled a carefully folded letter from her pocket, checking the address one final time. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, Matrimonial and Matchmaking Services. The boarding house stood at the end of the street, its fresh white paint and neat flower boxes setting it apart from the surrounding buildings. Clara counted her steps as she approached, a childhood habit that surfaced whenever her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. 112 steps from the stagecoach to Mrs. Sullivan's front door. She had barely touched the brass knocker when the door swung open, revealing a stout woman with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue Clara's every feature in a single glance. "You'll be the Zhang girl, then," Mrs. Sullivan said, her pronunciation of Clara's surname coming out as Zhang. "Right on time. Come in, come in. Let's get you settled before Mr. Peterson arrives." Clara bowed slightly, a gesture that seemed to puzzle Mrs. Sullivan, before following her into a parlor that smelled of lemon polish and fresh-baked bread. Everything gleamed with determined respectability, from the carefully arranged figurines on the mantel to the antimacassars protecting each chair's upholstery. "Sit," Mrs. Sullivan instructed, pointing to a straight-backed chair. "Tea." Clara nodded, grateful for this familiar ritual at least. She watched as Mrs. Sullivan poured, her movements efficient, but lacking the grace of the tea ceremonies Clara had grown up with. "Now then," Mrs. Sullivan said, settling into her own chair, with a ledger open on her lap. "Your letters indicated you understand English well enough, yes?" Another nod. "And you can speak it." Clara cleared her throat. "Yes," she managed, the word barely above a whisper. "I speak English." Mrs. Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly at Clara's accent, but she made a note in her ledger. "Mr. Peterson is a good man, owns a successful farm just outside town, looking for a sensible wife to help with the household and perhaps start a family. Your references from the mission school were quite impressive." Clara forced herself to meet Mrs. Sullivan's evaluating gaze. The matchmaker's expression softened slightly. "It's not easy coming to a strange place, but you'll find your footing. The West needs strong women, and you've already shown courage by coming this far." A knock at the door interrupted any response Clara might have made. Mrs. Sullivan stood, smoothing her skirts. "That'll be Mr. Peterson now. Remember, straight back, pleasant expression, speak clearly when spoken to." Clara's fingers found her hairpin once more as heavy boots sounded in the hallway. The jade was warm from her body heat. It's familiar. Curves grounding her as Mrs. Sullivan ushered in a tall man with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands. "Mr. Peterson, may I present Miss Clara Zhang, recently arrived from Shanghai by way of the mission school in San Francisco." Clara rose and attempted a smile, but Mr. Peterson's frown made it waver and fade. He circled her slowly, as one might. "Inspect a horse at auction. Bit small," he said finally. "Don't look strong enough for farm work." "I work hard," Clara whispered, the words catching in her throat. "Learn quickly. Speak up, girl. Can't hear a word you're saying." Clara tried again, but her voice seemed to shrink further under his impatient stare. Mrs. Sullivan stepped in smoothly. "Miss Zhang comes highly recommended. Her needlework is exceptional, and she's well versed in household management." But Mr. Peterson was already shaking his head. "Won't do. Need a wife who can speak up, give orders to farmhands, handle traders. Can't have a mouse running my household." He turned to Mrs. Sullivan. "You have anyone else available?" "Someone more suitable." Clara stood very still as they discussed other potential matches, her face carefully blank, even as shame burned in her chest. She had expected challenges in this new land, but somehow the casual dismissal hurt more than outright rejection would have. When Mr. Peterson left, Mrs. Sullivan sighed heavily. "Well, that's not the start we hoped for, but there are other possibilities. Mr. Harrison, perhaps, or the Wilson brothers up at Creek Bend. We'll find you a match, dear. Just try to speak up more next time." Clara nodded, but her fingers wrapped around her mother's hairpin told a different story. In Shanghai, silence had been a virtue, a sign of modesty and good breeding. Here, it seemed, it was just another word for worthless. Mrs. Sullivan's desk drawer creaked as she pulled out another marriage agreement. The crisp paper, a stark contrast to the crumpled contracts already littering her wastebasket. 3 days had passed since Mr. Peterson's rejection, and Clara watched as the matchmaker's practiced hand filled in the details. Agreement between Mr. Thomas Wilson of Creek Bend and Miss Clara Zhang, formerly of Shanghai. "The Wilson brothers run the lumber mill," Mrs. Sullivan explained, her pen scratching against paper. "Thomas is the younger one. Quiet himself, actually. Might be a better fit." Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, the memory of Mr. Peterson's dismissal still fresh in her mind. Through the parlor window, she could see the town's children playing in the street, their shouts and laughter carrying clearly through the spring air. One little girl noticed her watching and waved. Clara raised her hand to wave back, but the child had already turned away. "There now," Mrs. Sullivan said, sprinkling sand over the wet ink. "The Wilsons are expecting us this afternoon. I've arranged for Betty, that's my girl who helps with the cooking, to drive us out in the buggy." She paused, eyeing Clara's plain brown dress. "Perhaps, well, do you have anything more colourful to wear? Something more American?" Clara shook her head. Her other dress was even plainer, though at least it was clean. "Never mind then. We'll work with what we have." Mrs. Sullivan's tone was brisk but not unkind as she folded the agreement and slipped it into her reticule. "Remember what we practiced. Speak up, smile, and try to look interested." The drive to Creek Bend took them past Thornwood's outer farms and into thick pine forest. Clara watched the changing landscape with quiet fascination, noting how the trees grew denser and taller as they climbed into the hills. The air here smelled of sawdust and pine sap, and the steady rhythm of axes echoed through the woods. The Wilson brothers' house appeared suddenly around a bend, a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch and glass windows that must have cost a small fortune to transport from the east. Thomas Wilson stood waiting for them, tall and lean, like his lumber, with hands that could palm a dinner plate. "Mrs. Sullivan," he nodded, then turned to Clara. "Miss Zhang." His pronunciation was better than most, and something in his reserved manner gave Clara hope. But as Mrs. Sullivan made the formal introductions, she noticed Thomas Wilson's eyes kept sliding away from her face to fix on some point over her shoulder, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to look at her directly. They sat in a parlour that smelled of pine and fresh varnish. Thomas's older brother George and his wife Mary joined them, Mary serving coffee in delicate cups that seemed at odds with the frontier setting. The silence stretched uncomfortably until George cleared his throat. "Thomas tells us you're from China?" The way he said it made it sound like another planet. Clara nodded, then remembered Mrs. Sullivan's coaching. "Yes," she managed, "from Shanghai." "And you were educated at a mission school?" Mary Wilson asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yes, 3 years." 3 years, Thomas repeated slowly. "And before that?" Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "My father, he was merchant. Tea trade." "A merchant." George's eyebrows shot up. "Well, now that's something. Any experience with lumber?" Clara shook her head. "Speak up, dear," Mrs. Sullivan prompted quietly. "No," Clara whispered. "No lumber." Thomas shifted in his chair, that sideways glance becoming more pronounced. "Thing is, Miss Jang, running a lumber operation, well, it takes a certain kind of woman. Needs someone who can manage accounts, deal with suppliers, lot of talking involved." "I can learn," Clara said, but her voice was lost under Mary Wilson's sudden cough. The rest of the visit passed in a blur of awkward silences and halting attempts at conversation. When Thomas escorted them back to the buggy, his relief was palpable. "I'm sure you understand," he said to Mrs. Sullivan, not even glancing at Clara. "Just not the right fit." That evening, Clara watched from her window as Mrs. Sullivan tore up another marriage agreement, the pieces catching the last rays of sunlight as they fell into the wastebasket. Each torn contract felt like another piece of her hope falling away, another reminder that she was as out of place here as a fish in the desert. In the growing darkness, she could just make out the silhouette of the mountains against the sky. Somewhere in those hills, she knew, was the answer to her prayers. She just had to find the courage to keep looking. Clara sat cross-legged on her narrow bed, counting the coins that remained of her savings. The porcelain rice bowl beside her, a humble reminder of home, sat empty, much like her prospects. 3 weeks in Thornwood had depleted both her funds and her confidence. Yesterday's meeting with Mr. Harrison, a shopkeeper seeking a wife, had ended like all the others. "Too timid," he'd declared to Mrs. Sullivan, as if Clara weren't sitting right there. "Customers need a friendly face. Behind the counter, someone who can chat and make them feel welcome. This one barely makes eye contact." A floorboard creaked outside her door, followed by Mrs. Sullivan's familiar knock. "Clara, I've brought your breakfast." The matchmaker entered carrying a tray, her face pinched with concern as she noted the counting ritual. Clara quickly swept the coins back into their cloth pouch, but not before Mrs. Sullivan had taken stock of their meagre sum. "We need to discuss your situation," Mrs. Sullivan said, setting down the tray. "I've sent inquiries to other towns, but—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your boarding fees are nearly due." Clara nodded, her throat tight. She'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it really, ever since Mr. Harrison's rejection. 3 failed matches in as many weeks. Word would be spreading through the territory by now. "There might be other options," Mrs. Sullivan continued, pouring tea into Clara's empty rice bowl, since all the cups were still packed away. "Mrs. Chen at the laundry mentioned needing help. It's not what you came here for. But it would give you time to improve your English, learn our ways better." The suggestion stung, but Clara forced herself to consider it pragmatically. Working in a laundry wasn't so different from what many women did back home. At least Mrs. Chen would understand her silences. "How much?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible above the morning birds outside her window. $3 a week, plus meals. Mrs. Sullivan's tone was gentle. "You could keep your room here for a reduced rate, of course." just until we find a more suitable arrangement." Clara's fingers traced the rim of her rice bowl, now serving such a foreign purpose. She thought of her mother's face when she'd left Shanghai, so full of hope for her daughter's future in America. What would she say now, seeing Clara reduced to taking in washing? Through her window, she could see the distant outline of the McKinnon ranch sprawling across the foothills. She'd heard whispers about its owner, the deaf man who'd built an empire from nothing but grit and determination. Sometimes, in her lowest moments, she wondered what it would be like to live in a world without sound, where silence was the natural state of things. A wagon rattled past on the street below, carrying lumber from the Wilson Brothers mill. Clara straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the simple dignity her mother had always taught her to maintain, even in hardship. "I will work," she said, meeting Mrs. Sullivan's eyes directly for perhaps the first time since her arrival. The matchmaker's face softened with something that might have been respect. "I'll speak to Mrs. Chen today, and Clara," she paused at the door, "this doesn't mean we're giving up on finding you a match. Sometimes the right path takes an unexpected turn." Left alone, Clara began carefully packing away her few belongings. The jade hairpin went back into its silk wrapping. Her spare dress was shaken out and hung to air. Each movement was measured, precise, a dancer's economy of motion that had always come naturally to her. When she reached for her rice bowl, she found herself studying its empty surface, seeing in its pristine white depths all the dreams she'd carried across an ocean. How strange that she'd once thought silence was a virtue, only to find it was the heaviest burden she could bear in this loud new world. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of cattle lowing, probably from the McKinnon ranch. Clara found herself wondering again about its owner, about how he managed to command respect without words. Perhaps there were other ways to be heard, other languages besides speech. She wrapped the rice bowl carefully in a spare chemise and tucked it away. Tomorrow she would begin her new life at Mrs. Chen's laundry. But today she would allow herself one last moment of grief for the future she'd imagined, before squaring her shoulders to face the future she'd been given. The coins clinked softly in their pouch as she tucked them away. No longer enough for dreams, but perhaps enough for survival. And sometimes, she reminded herself, survival was its own kind of victory. James McKinnon's ranch ledger told stories that went far beyond simple numbers. Each entry was written with meticulous precision, the letters formed with an almost artistic attention to detail. Not just accounts, but a daily chronicle of ranch life. April 15th, 1885. New calf born to red heifer. Strong legs. White star on forehead. Tom says mother doing well. The notes captured what his ears could not, creating order in his silent world. Tonight, he added a different kind of entry. Chinese woman at Mrs. Chen's laundry moves like flowing water. Hands speak more than most people's voices. He studied the words, wondering if they revealed too much about his growing fascination with the newcomer he'd been watching this past week. From his office window, he could see most of Thornwood's main street. The laundry sat just past the general store, its backyard now adorned with rows of billowing white sheets. Several times a day, he watched the young woman, Clara Zhang, he'd learned her name from his foreman's wife, move between the lines of laundry with a grace that made even the most mundane tasks seem like choreography. He recognized something. In her careful movements, a language of gesture he understood all too well. The way she ducked her head when townspeople passed, how her hands fluttered like startled birds when someone spoke too quickly. These were the signs of someone who, like him, lived in a world slightly apart from others. His housekeeper, Martha, appeared in the doorway, her hands moving in the sign language they'd developed over the years. "Supper's ready, and you're brooding again." James smiled, signing back, "Just working on the ledger." Martha's skeptical look told him she wasn't. Fooled. She'd worked for him since he'd first bought the ranch 15 years ago, when he was just 20, and determined to prove that deafness wouldn't limit his dreams. She'd been the first to learn his signs, then taught them to the ranch hands. Now the Flying M Ranch was known as much for its unique system of communication as for its prize cattle. "The laundry girl again?" Martha signed, her eyes twinkling. James shook his head, but his gaze drifted back to the window. Clara was there, gathering sheets as the sun set. Even from this distance, he could see the care in her movements, the way she folded each piece with reverence, as if the simple act contained all the dignity she'd been denied by the town's rejection. He'd heard about the failed matches. News traveled fast in Thornwood, especially news of failure. The town's judgment seemed especially cruel to him. How many times had he been dismissed before proving himself? How many people had mistaken his silence for simplicity? Martha touched his shoulder, drawing his attention back. "You could go introduce yourself," she signed. The suggestion sent an unexpected flutter through his stomach. He turned back to his ledger, signing without looking up. "She has enough trouble without being seen with the deaf rancher." "The deaf rancher who owns half the valley?" Martha countered, her signs sharp with frustration. "The deaf rancher who built all this from nothing. The deaf rancher who still has to write everything down to do business in town," James interrupted, his hands cutting through the air. "Who still sees people turn away when they realize they'll have to work harder to communicate." Martha's expression softened. She pulled a chair close, waiting until he met her eyes. "Maybe," she signed slowly. "That's exactly why you should meet her. You, more than anyone, know what it's like to have your silence misunderstood." James ran his fingers over the neat rows of text in his ledger. Each page represented years of proving himself, of showing that his worth lay in more than his ability to speak. He'd built his ranch on the understanding that there were many ways to communicate if people only took the time to learn them. Through the window, he watched Clara finish her work, gathering her empty basket as darkness settled over the town. There was a solitude about her that called to something deep in his chest, a recognition of a kindred spirit navigating a world that demanded voice when silence held its own wisdom. Martha patted his hand, then signed with gentle understanding, "Not all songs need to be heard to be felt." James nodded, turning to a fresh page in his ledger. Tomorrow, he decided, he would need to send some shirts to the laundry. Perhaps it was time to let silence speak for itself. The washboard slipped from Clara's hands just as the McKinnon Ranch's weekly laundry arrived. An armful of shirts and a moment's distraction conspiring to send the wooden frame crashing to the ground. The crack of splintering wood seemed to echo through the entire laundry, drawing Mrs. Chen from the back room. "Ayah!" The older woman hurried over, her face creased with concern. "That was our best board." Clara knelt to gather the broken pieces, her cheeks burning with shame. The washboard had been expensive, imported from San Francisco, a week's wages at least. "I will pay," she whispered in Cantonese, but Mrs. Chen was no longer looking at the broken washboard. Her attention had shifted to the doorway where a tall figure now stood. Clara looked up to find James McKinnon watching them, his expression curious rather than impatient. She'd seen him before, of course. Everyone in Thornwood knew the deaf rancher by sight, but never this close. His eyes were a startling shade of green, intent and observant in a way that made her feel suddenly self-conscious of every movement. Mrs. Chen stepped forward, speaking slowly and clearly, as most townspeople did when addressing him. "Mr. McKinnon, we have your laundry ready, just need to—" But James wasn't watching Mrs. Chen's words. His attention remained fixed on Clara, particularly on her hands, as they cradled the broken washboard. Without speaking, he moved closer and knelt beside her, gently taking one of the splintered pieces to examine it. Clara held perfectly still, aware of every breath, every tiny shift of her body. James pulled a small notebook from his pocket, wrote something quickly, and held it out to her. "Can this be repaired?" The note read in elegant handwriting. Clara studied the break, then shook her head. Catching herself, she reached for the notebook and pencil, her own characters careful and small beneath his. "Too much damage. Need new." A slight smile touched James's lips as he read her response. He wrote again, "You write very precisely, like drawing." The unexpected compliment made Clara's breath catch. She found herself responding without the usual anxiety that accompanied communication here. Chinese characters are like pictures. Each stroke matters. James nodded, his expression brightening with interest. He wrote, "Show me." Clara hesitated, only a moment before taking the pencil. With deliberate strokes, she drew the character for silence, then beside it, peace. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of countless calligraphy lessons, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms. James watched intently, his eyes following each line as it formed. When she finished, he pointed to the characters, his eyebrows raised in question. Clara wrote their meanings beneath them, then added, "In Chinese, they are connected. Silence brings peace." Something shifted in James's expression, recognition perhaps, or understanding. He touched the character for silence, then gestured to himself, then to her, his movements forming a connection that needed no words. Mrs. Chen cleared her throat, startling them both. Clara had almost forgotten she was there. The older woman's expression was difficult to read as she looked between them. James stood smoothly, helping Clara to her feet with a gentle strength that sent an unexpected warmth through her palm. He wrote one final note, "I'll bring a new washboard tomorrow and more shirts that need washing." Before Clara could protest, he tipped his hat and strode out, his long legs carrying him quickly down the street. She watched him go, still holding his pencil, aware that something fundamental had shifted in her world. Mrs. Chen picked up the broken washboard pieces, clucking her tongue. "That man sees more than most people here," she said in Cantonese. "But be careful, little sister. The town already talks enough about both of you." Clara nodded, but her fingers were tracing the characters she'd drawn, feeling the echo of James's understanding in each line. For the first time since arriving in Thornwood, she'd communicated with someone without feeling like she'd failed at it. She carefully tore the page from the notebook and tucked it into her pocket, a tangible reminder that perhaps there were other ways to be heard in this loud new world. The broken washboard had seemed like a disaster moments ago. Now, watching James McKinnon's retreating figure, she wondered if sometimes broken things could lead to something unexpectedly whole. True to his word, James returned the next day, not just with a new washboard, but with something else, a stack of carefully drawn cards, each featuring a simple illustration paired with a hand gesture. He spread them out on Mrs. Chen's clean sorting table while Clara watched, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. The first card showed a sun, beneath it the word day, and in the corner a sketch of hands making a circular motion above the head. James demonstrated the gesture, then waited, his green eyes patient and encouraging. Clara mimicked the movement, her hands uncertain at first but growing more confident as James nodded his approval. He pointed to himself, made the sign, then pointed to her, a silent good day. Mrs. Chen watched from her corner, pretending to sort linens while keeping a careful eye on the proceedings. "The whole town will be talking by sunset," she muttered in Cantonese, but Clara noticed she made no move to interrupt. They worked through more cards. "Thank you." Hands flowing from chin outward. "Please." A circular motion over the heart. "Friend." Clasped hands moving forward. Each gesture was like learning a new character. A dance of meaning that Clara found herself absorbing with unexpected ease. James pulled out his notebook. "You learn quickly, like you've been waiting for these words." Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks as she wrote back, "My hands have always wanted to speak. They just didn't know how." He smiled at that, a warm expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes. From his satchel, he produced more cards, these ones blank, setting them. Before her, he wrote, "Teach me yours now." Understanding bloomed in Clara's chest. She picked up a pencil and began to draw, starting with simple concepts. The character for water, showing how the written strokes flowed like a river. Heart, with its delicate curves. Strength, built from layers of meaning. James watched. With the same intensity he'd shown that first day, his hands occasionally moving, as if trying to capture the essence of each character in gesture. Together, they began creating something new, a bridge between their worlds, built of ink and motion. A customer's entrance interrupted their lesson. Clara quickly gathered the cards, but not before the woman's eyes widened with recognition. She hurried back out without dropping off her laundry, no doubt headed straight for the general store, where gossip spread faster than prairie fire. James noticed Clara's discomfort. He wrote, "People talked about me too when I first came here, said a deaf man couldn't run a ranch." Clara's response came faster now, her English flowing more easily onto the page. "How did you prove them wrong?" "By building something too big to ignore." He gestured expansively toward his ranch, visible through the window. "And by creating my own way to speak. The whole ranch uses my signs now. Even the cattle respond to them." The idea struck Clara. With unexpected force, the possibility of creating a world where silence wasn't a flaw, but simply another way of being. She thought of all the failed matches, the dismissals, the judgments. Perhaps she too had been trying to fit herself into a space too small for who she really was. James seemed to read her thoughts. He selected a blank card and drew carefully. A bird, first in a cage, then soaring free. Beneath it, he wrote, "Some songs can only be sung by being true to your own voice." Clara took the pencil, adding Chinese characters beside his drawing. "Freedom comes from finding your own path." They shared a look of perfect understanding, the kind that needed no words in any language. Then James gathered his cards, leaving one behind, the sign for friend, and wrote a final note. "Same time tomorrow?" After he left, Mrs. Chen approached, picking up the card he'd left. "Well," she said, switching to English with unusual precision, "at least he brings good business." But her tone was softer than her words, and Clara caught her practicing the sign for friend when she thought no one was looking. That evening, Clara sat at her small desk in Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house, carefully copying James's cards and adding her own illustrations. Chinese characters blending with hand signs, creating something that was neither fully one nor the other, but somehow completely new. She traced the sign for friend over and over, each movement feeling more natural than the last. Outside her window, the setting sun painted Thornwood's main street in shades of gold, and for the first time since arriving, the town's constant noise didn't seem so overwhelming. She was learning a different way to listen, a different way to speak, and in the process, discovering that perhaps she hadn't been too quiet after all. She'd simply been waiting for someone who knew how to hear her. Among Mrs. Sullivan's prized possessions was a collection of sheet music, yellowed pages filled with notes that promised to transform silence into song. As Clara dusted the matchmaker's parlor one morning, she found herself studying a particular piece, Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns of notes across the staff. "Do you play?" Mrs. Sullivan's voice startled her. Clara shook her head, carefully returning the sheet music to its place. "Shame," Mrs. Sullivan said, adjusting her spectacles. "Though I suppose you're busy enough these days, what with all those lessons." The way she said lessons made it clear she'd heard the town's whispers about Clara's daily meetings with James McKinnon. But before Clara could respond, a familiar figure appeared in the parlor doorway. James stood holding their growing collection of communication cards, his presence drawing Mrs. Sullivan's attention like a magnet. Clara noticed how the matchmaker's expression shifted from disapproval to cautious curiosity as James pulled out his notebook and wrote with his usual precise strokes, "May I borrow Miss Zhang for our lesson? We're working on ranch terminology." "Today," Mrs. Sullivan glanced between them, then nodded slowly. "Mind your back before dark, Clara, and stay where people can see you." They settled in their usual spot on the laundry's back porch, where the afternoon sun warmed the wooden planks and the smell of clean linens drifted from the drying lines. James spread out their cards, but today he added something new, a series of fluid gestures that mimicked the rhythm of horse hooves. Clara watched, fascinated, as he demonstrated how his ranch hands could signal from a distance, 2 fingers trotting across his palm for walking cattle, a sweeping motion for gathering, strays, sharp gestures for danger or urgency. Each movement was like a note in a silent symphony, carrying meaning across the open range. She found herself adding her own flourishes to the signs, incorporating the elegant movements of Chinese dance she'd learned as a child. When signing, "River!" Her hands flowed like water, for mountain they rose in graceful peaks. James watched with evident delight, quickly adopting her refinements. Together, they were creating something unique, a language that was part ranch sign, part Chinese gesture, and wholly their own. Like a piece of music written in 4 hands, their communication evolved into a dance of shared understanding. A small crowd had gathered at the general store across the street, watching their silent exchange with undisguised interest. Clara might have withdrawn once, but now she barely noticed them. She was too absorbed in learning how James's ranch hands could coordinate an entire cattle drive without a word, using just these elegant hand signals. James wrote in his notebook, "You've added beauty to necessity. These signs were just tools. Before, now they're poetry." Clara ducked her head, pleased but embarrassed. She wrote back, "In Shanghai, we say that true communication happens in the spaces between words." He nodded thoughtfully, then gestured to the sheet music visible through Mrs. Sullivan's window. His hands moved in a new pattern, fingers dancing, over imaginary piano keys, then drawing their signs in the air like musical notes. Clara understood immediately. She wrote, "We're creating our own music?" "A duet," he wrote back, his smile warming his entire face. The afternoon light was fading when Mrs. Sullivan appeared to reclaim her charge. But before Clara went inside, James taught her one last sign, his hands forming shapes that seemed to capture the essence of joy itself. Later that night, Clara practiced their new signs in the privacy of her room, her hands moving through the sequences like a dancer remembering steps. Outside, a piano played somewhere in the gathering darkness, its melody drifting through her open window. But Clara was learning that music didn't always need sound to touch the heart. She thought of James's last sign, the one he'd taught her just before leaving. She'd looked up its meaning in their growing dictionary of cards after he'd gone. There. It was, drawn in his careful hand. Beautiful, not quiet, not strange. Not any of the words Thornwood had used to dismiss her. Beautiful. Clara's hands formed the sign again, feeling its truth in every graceful movement. In the morning, she would teach James the Chinese character for the same word, and together, they would add another note to their unique symphony of silence. The Thornwood Gazette wasn't known for its subtlety. Clara first saw the article while delivering fresh linens to the general store. Local ranchers' strange friendship raises eyebrows. Below the headline was a brief but pointed piece questioning James McKinnon's judgment in spending time with the Oriental laundress and speculating about the impact on his business relationships. She might have fled back to the laundry if Martha, James's housekeeper, hadn't chosen that moment to appear beside her. Without a word, Martha took the newspaper from Clara's trembling hands and used it to wrap the cheese she'd just purchased, effectively burying the offensive headline in yellow cheddar. But the damage was already done. By mid-morning, James's brother William had ridden into town from his own ranch, 20 miles south, making straight for the laundry, where James and Clara were reviewing their latest communication cards. "This has gone far enough, James," William announced, tossing the newspaper onto their work table. His signs were sharp, aggressive, each gesture an accusation. "The whole territory's talking." James remained seated, his expression calm but firm as his hands moved in response. "Let them talk. It's not just talk. Peterson's threatening to pull his cattle contract. The Wilsons won't sell you lumber at fair prices anymore. And now this? William jabbed a finger at the article. You're throwing away everything you've built, Clara began, gathering the cards, meaning to slip away. But James caught her wrist gently. His touch anchored her in place as he stood to face his brother. I built this ranch my way, James signed, his movements deliberate and clear. Against everyone's advice, against your advice. This is different, William's hands flew. She's teaching me more about communication than I've learned in years, James interrupted, his signs flowing with passionate precision. Show him, Clara. She hesitated, but James's encouraging nod gave her courage. Slowly, she demonstrated the newest signs, a blend of ranch gestures and Chinese courtesy that could convey complex messages across any distance. William watched, his frown deepening, as she showed how a simple cattle drive command had evolved into a nuanced system for coordinating multiple riders. It's more efficient than our old methods, James signed. The hands picked it up in days. Even the Crow Scouts who work our north pasture say it's better than what they've been using. William's expression wavered. He'd always been the practical one, more concerned with profit than propriety. Peterson's contract, he began, can be replaced, James cut him off. The Crow Nation has better grazing land anyway. I've been meaning to expand north. Clara watched the brothers exchange, understanding more than they realized. She'd seen similar scenes in her father's tea warehouse, business concerns masking deeper anxieties about change and tradition. Finally, she pulled out her notebook and wrote in her increasingly confident English, "Your brother built his success by finding new ways to overcome obstacles. Isn't that what we're doing now?" William read her note, surprise flickering across his features. Perhaps he'd assumed she couldn't write English at all. He studied her for a long moment, then turned back to James. "The girl has a point," he signed reluctantly. "But the town thought a deaf man couldn't run a ranch," James responded. They were wrong then too. A noise from the street drew their attention. Through the window they could see Mrs. Sullivan deep in conversation with the newspaper editor, her expression fierce as she jabbed her finger at a copy of the article. Behind them, Mrs. Chen had emerged from the laundry's back room, her usual reserved manner replaced by rapid fire. Cantonese that made the editor take a step backward. Clara felt warmth bloom in her chest at this unexpected show of support. She wrote again, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words." William read her note and shook his head, but there was a hint of a smile beneath his mustache. "You're as stubborn as he is," he signed, Clara recognizing the gesture from her lessons. "More," she signed back, surprising a laugh out of both brothers. After William left, James wrote in their shared notebook, "I'm sorry about the article." Clara considered her response carefully, then drew the Chinese character for strength beside their growing vocabulary of signs. Below it, she wrote, "Your brother is right about one thing. I am stubborn." James's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. He added another character to their dictionary that day, the sign for courage blended with the Chinese symbol for together. One more note in their continuing symphony of silence, drowning out the newspaper's harsh melody with something far more powerful: understanding. The journal's binding was worn soft with use, its pages filled with Clara's careful Chinese characters flowing from right to left. She hadn't meant to show it to James. These were her private thoughts, her fears, her memories. But when he found her crying behind the laundry after another hostile encounter in the general store, she found herself pulling the small book from her pocket. James sat beside her on the back steps, their shoulders nearly touching as she opened to the first page. Through tears and tentative signs, she began to translate. "I was not always silent," she wrote in their shared notebook, then pointed to the corresponding passage. "In Shanghai, I taught music to children, piano like your mother's sheet music. I sang in the mission church choir. My voice was—" She paused, searching for the right word. praised. James's expression registered surprise, but he waited patiently as she continued. Then the fever came, 3 days of burning. When it broke, my throat, her hands trembled slightly. The doctors said the damage was permanent. My voice became this whisper. The children's parents complained. They wanted a teacher who could demonstrate proper singing, who could call out instructions clearly. Understanding dawned in James's eyes. He wrote, "So you came here?" Clara nodded, turning pages, until she found another entry. The matchmaker in San Francisco said American farmers wouldn't care if a wife was quiet as long as she could work. But she was wrong. James took the notebook. People fear what they don't understand. Watch. He stood and walked several paces, away, then began to sign the story she'd never heard, his own truth finally revealed. Through their shared language, he told of the fever that had taken his hearing as a child, of the years spent learning to read lips and speak words he could no longer hear, of his father's insistence that he attend a special school back east, and his determination to prove he could succeed on his own terms instead. "The ranch hands thought I was simple at first," he wrote after finishing his signed story. "They would talk behind my back, not knowing I could read every word on their lips. It made me angry, until I realized their judgment said more about them than me." Clara's fingers traced the characters in her journal, describing her own struggles with judgment. James watched the movement, then gently took her hand and shaped it into a new sign, one that combined their gesture for understanding with strength. She found the page where she'd written about her first weeks in Thornwood, the loneliness and despair that had nearly overwhelmed her. James read her translation, then shared his own memories of early days on the ranch, when every success was dismissed as luck and every failure was blamed on his deafness. "How did you bear it?" Clara wrote. "By remembering that other people's limitations aren't mine," he responded. Then he pointed to a bright red ribbon marking a page in her journal. "What's this?" Clara hesitated before opening to the marked entry. It was recent, written the day after they'd created their first shared signs, with halting gestures and written words. She translated the passage about finding unexpected joy in their silent conversations, about feeling truly heard for the first time since the fever. James's face softened as he read. He took the notebook and wrote, "I understand. Every new sign we create feels like music." Clara finished for him, both in writing and with a flowing gesture they'd developed for the word. She turned to the journal's final entry, written just that morning. The characters were less formal here, emotions spilling across the page in swift strokes. "I never thought silence could be so full," she translated, "or that someone could hear the songs I can no longer sing." James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. His hand moved in their sign for beautiful, the gesture that had first shown her how he saw past her silence to her true self. Clara closed the journal, but kept it on her lap rather than hiding it away again. Sometimes truth, once revealed, refused to be buried. She had spent so long believing her silence was a prison, never imagining it could become a bridge instead. James wrote one last note. "Tomorrow, I want to show you something at the ranch, a place where sound has never mattered, but music is everywhere." Clara nodded, managing a smile as she tucked her journal away. Its weight in her pocket felt different now, lighter somehow, as if sharing its burden had transformed it from a record of loss into a chronicle of discovery. The ranch deed lay between them on James's oak desk, its official seal catching the morning light. Clara read the freshly written addition to the document, her heart beating so loudly she was sure even James could hear it. "Or hereby transfer joint ownership of the Flying M Ranch to James McKinnon, and upon completion of marriage vows, Clara Zhang McKinnon." James watched her face intently as she processed the words. Outside his office window, ranch hands were using their new hybrid sign language to coordinate the morning's cattle drive, their fluid gestures a testament to how much had changed in just a few months. "I know it's sudden," James wrote in their notebook, then added, "or perhaps not sudden at all." Clara touched the deed's embossed letterhead, remembering the place he'd shown her yesterday. A hidden valley on the ranch's northern border, where wildflowers grew in such abundance they painted the landscape in waves of color. He'd taught her the sign for each flower, and she'd shown him the Chinese characters for their names. Together, they'd created new signs that captured both meaning and beauty. "The ranch hands," she wrote back. "They accept this?" James smiled and gestured to the window. Tom, his foreman, was teaching a new hand their signs for different types of cattle. The man's movements were still clumsy, but he was trying, his face screwed up in concentration as he practiced. "They were the ones who suggested it," James wrote. "Martha says they've never seen the ranch run so smoothly since we developed the new signal system." Clara's fingers moved to her jade hairpin, its familiar weight grounding her as she considered the magnitude of what James was offering. Not just marriage, but true partnership. Not just a home, but a place where her silence would be an asset rather than a flaw. "Your brother," she began to write, but James shook his head firmly. "William has seen the books," he responded on paper. "Our efficiency has increased 30% since implementing your improvements to the sign system. Even he can't argue with those numbers." Clara stood and walked to the window, watching the ranch hands at work. Their gestures had taken on a distinctly graceful quality that reminded her of her days teaching music, when rhythm and movement came together to create something greater than their parts. "And the town," she wrote when she returned to the desk. James's expression hardened slightly. "The town doesn't run this ranch. We do." He paused, then added more gently, "But they're coming around. Mrs. Sullivan has been quite persuasive in her defense of us." Clara smiled, remembering how the matchmaker had transformed from skeptic to champion, especially after seeing their communication system in action. Even Mr. Peterson, who'd once dismissed Clara as too quiet, now specifically requested her help in teaching basic signs to his farmhands. Still, marriage, it was more than she dared hope for when she first arrived in Thornwood. She pulled out her journal and found the entry from her first day at the laundry, showing James how she'd described feeling like a bird in a cage, trapped by silence and others' expectations. James read it, then wrote, "And now?" Clara took a deep breath and lifted her hands, using their private signs to respond. "Now I feel like I'm flying." James's smile was brighter than the morning sun. He stood and moved around the desk, kneeling beside her chair. His hands formed the questions they'd created together over the past months. "Will you build this with me? Will you make our silence into music? Will you be my partner in all things?" Clara's hands trembled as she signed back, combining Chinese grace with ranch practicality. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." James pressed his lips to her fingers, then reached into his desk drawer and brought out a small box. Inside was a silver ring, engraved with a design that made Clara's breath catch. Their signs for love and music, intertwined with Chinese characters for harmony and strength. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara looked again at the deed on the desk. Her name looked right there, she realized. It looked like belonging, like a future built on understanding instead of judgment, like a song finally finding its perfect harmony. The storm struck 3 days after the engagement announcement, as if nature itself wanted to test their resolve. Dark clouds rolled in from the mountains, bringing wind that bent the pine trees like blades of grass. Clara watched from the ranch house window as James and his men raced to secure everything they could, their hands flashing urgent signals through the growing gloom. Martha touched her shoulder, signing quickly. "The north pasture gate is broken. Cattle will scatter if it's not fixed." Clara was moving before Martha finished, grabbing James's oilskin coat from its peg. Outside, the wind tried to tear it from her shoulders as she made her way to the barn. James spotted her and started to protest, his hands forming signs of concern. But Clara's response was swift and certain. "I can help." The rain began as they rowed out together, heavy drops that quickly turned to stinging sheets. Through it all, their hands kept moving, Clara adapting their signs to be visible through the downpour, incorporating broad gestures that could be seen at a distance. The ranch hands followed their lead, the new system proving its worth as they coordinated without a single spoken word. They found the broken gate hanging from one hinge, threatening to pull free completely. Beyond it, cattle were already beginning to drift, drawn by the wind's wild song. James swung down from his horse, and Clara followed, their movements synchronized. By months of working together, the repair would normally take 3 men, but they had no choice. Clara held the gate steady while James hammered, their bodies braced against the gale. When he needed tools, she anticipated his needs, remembering the signs he'd taught her for each piece of equipment. Every few minutes they checked the herd through the rain's grey curtain, signing updates to the hands who were working to keep the cattle contained. A sudden gust caught the gate, wrenching it sideways. Clara felt something tear in her shoulder as she fought to hold it, but she didn't let go. James's hands flashed concern, but she shook her head. Together, they forced the gate back into position, securing it with double braces against the storm's fury. By the time they finished, both were drenched to the bone, covered in mud, and grinning like children. They'd done it, not just fixing the gate, but proving that their unique way of communicating could work even in the worst conditions. The ride back was slower, careful in the deepening dark. They found the ranch house blazing with lamplight, Martha waiting with hot coffee and dry clothes. But before they went inside, James pulled Clara close, his hands forming words against her back, "Proud of you." She responded by teaching him a new sign, one that combined their gesture for partnership with the Chinese character for endurance. It felt right, creating something new even in the aftermath of chaos. The next morning revealed the storm's full impact. Fences down, roof tiles scattered, the chicken coop listing to one side. But it also showed something else. The entire crew was already at work, using Clara and James's signals to coordinate repairs. Even William had ridden over to help, his hands moving competently through the signs they'd created. Clara stood on the porch, cataloguing damage and organizing work teams with gestures that flowed as naturally as breathing. A movement caught her eye, Mrs. Sullivan's buggy approaching through the mud. The matchmaker had been concerned about Clara living at the ranch before the wedding, but propriety had given way to practicality during the storm. Now Mrs. Sullivan climbed down, surveying the scene with sharp eyes. She watched as Clara directed repairs with silent authority, as the hands responded to her signals without hesitation, as James and she worked in seamless coordination. Finally, the older woman nodded and signed, somewhat stiffly, but clearly. "Impracticed, you have built something strong here." It wasn't just the ranch she was talking about, Clara knew. In the face of the storm, they had demonstrated what she and James had known all along, that true communication transcended conventional methods, that strength could be found in unexpected forms, that what some saw as limitations could become foundations for something extraordinary. That evening, as they sat in James's office reviewing repair estimates, Clara found herself repeatedly touching her jade hairpin, no longer as a comfort, but as a reminder. She had carried her mother's hopes across an ocean, endured rejection and judgment, and finally found her place in the most unexpected way. The storm had tested them, yes, but like the Chinese bamboo her mother had loved, the kind that bent. In the wind, but never broke, they had emerged stronger for it. Clara sat at James's desk, an empty sheet of paper before her, the morning sun warming the ranch house's study. Her first letter to James's mother in Boston needed to be perfect. She'd been practicing her English writing for weeks, determined to bridge the distance not just in miles, but in understanding. "Dear Mrs. McKinnon," she wrote, her penmanship careful and measured. "Your son has taught me that silence holds its own kind of music." The words came slowly at first, then with growing confidence, as she described life on the ranch, the sign language she and James had created together, and the way the hands now moved like dancers across the pastures, their gestures coordinating. Complex operations with ballet-like precision. She wrote about teaching Chinese characters to James, about how he saw the poetry in their shapes, just as she saw the poetry in his signs. She described their shared language as a symphony composed of movement instead of sound, no less beautiful for its silence. Martha brought tea, pausing to read over Clara's shoulder. Her weathered hands shaped encouragement. She'll like the music metaphors. She was a piano teacher before she married. This detail made Clara sit straighter. She added a passage about her own music teaching days in Shanghai, drawing parallels between conducting a choir and orchestrating ranch operations. Different languages of gesture, she wrote, but the same need for harmony and precise timing. James found her there hours. Later, surrounded by discarded drafts, he read the final version, his smile growing with each paragraph. When he finished, his hands moved in their private sign, perfect harmony. But Clara wasn't finished. She had one more thing to add, something she'd been practicing in secret with Martha's help. At the bottom of the letter, in careful English. "Script," she wrote, "I know I may not be the daughter-in-law you imagined for your son, but I promise you this. Every day, I will work to prove that love needs no voice to sing its truth." James read these last lines twice, then pulled her to her feet and into an embrace that spoke louder than any words could have. The reply came faster than expected. Clara's hands trembled as she opened the envelope 2 weeks later. James and Martha hovering nearby with barely concealed anticipation. Inside was a sheet of music, Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11, the same piece she'd admired in Mrs. Sullivan's parlor. But this copy was different. Above the staff, Mrs. McKinnon had meticulously annotated each measure with small drawings of hands, showing how the music could be expressed through gesture. "My dear Clara," the accompanying letter began, "music, as you so beautifully express, takes many forms. I've spent the past week translating this piece into the language you and James have created. Perhaps together we can find new ways to hear its melody." Clara sank into James's chair, overcome. She had expected polite tolerance at best, outright rejection at worst. Instead, she held in her hands a gift of extraordinary understanding, a bridge built from music to movement, from sound to silence. James read his mother's letter with shining eyes, then surprised Clara by sitting at the study's small piano. A piece of furniture she'd assumed was merely decorative. His hands moved over the keys without pressing them, following his mother's gestural notation, while Clara watched the silent performance in wonder. Martha, who had been with the family long enough to remember James before he lost his hearing, sighed with tears in her eyes. That was his favorite piece to play. He hasn't touched the piano since the fever. Clara moved to stand behind James, her hands gently covering his. Together, they began to shape the music into their shared signs, transforming Mozart's notes into a dance of fingers and palms. When they finished, even Martha was moving her hands in approximate accompaniment, the three of them conducting a silent orchestra in the warm afternoon light. That evening, Clara added a new entry to her journal, this time writing in English. Alongside her Chinese characters, "Today I learned that family, like music, can transcend the boundaries of sound. That acceptance, when it comes from true understanding, is its own kind of melody." She looked out the study window at the ranch, hands returning from the day's work, their signs flowing smoothly as they discussed tomorrow's tasks. In town, she knew, Mrs. Sullivan was teaching basic signs to her new boarders. The general store had posted a chart of common gestures near the counter. Even the church had asked about incorporating their system into Sunday services. Clara touched the jade hairpin in her hair, then reached for fresh paper. She had another letter to write, this one to her mother in Shanghai, telling her about the unexpected way her daughter's voice had finally found its song. The McKinnon family Bible arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, delivered by William. with an expression that suggested he was carrying dynamite rather than scripture. Its leather binding was worn smooth by generations of hands, its pages filled with births, deaths, and marriages stretching back to Scotland. "Mother sent it," William signed, watching Clara's reaction carefully. "For the ceremony." Clara recognized the weight of this gesture. Not just the physical heft of the Bible in her hands, but the generations of tradition it represented. Each McKinnon marriage since 1785 had been recorded in these pages, each name written in careful script, testifying to the continuity of family and faith. But when she opened it, something fell from between the pages, a letter addressed to James in an elegant hand she recognized from the sheet music annotations. Her heart stuttered as James read it, his expression unreadable. "Mother's coming," he signed finally, "for the wedding, and she's bringing father." The news spread through the ranch like wildfire, hands signing rapidly between chores. Clara watched them from the study window, remembering James's stories about his father, a proud Boston banker who had never quite forgiven his son for choosing the ranch over the special school back east. Martha found her there, still holding the Bible. "Mr. McKinnon Sr. hasn't set foot on this ranch since James bought it," she signed. "Didn't think it proper for his son to be working with his hands instead of his head." Clara's fingers traced the family names in the Bible, wondering where or if her Chinese name would fit among these generations of McKinnons. James appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her thoughts. "We can have a simple ceremony," he signed, "before they arrive." But Clara shook her head. She'd run from challenges before, in Shanghai and San Francisco. Not this time. Instead, she opened her journal and showed James her latest project. She'd been practicing hymns in sign language, transforming the church songs into flowing gestures that maintained their essential grace. His eyes widened as she demonstrated, her hands dancing through amazing grace in a combination of their ranch signs and Chinese performance art. When she finished, he pulled her close, his hands spelling out "brave" against her back. The next, weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Clara split her time between ranch work and poring over the family Bible, learning the McKinnon history. She noted how many of the women had come from far places themselves, following love across oceans and prairies. Their courage gave her strength. The day his parents arrived, Clara wore her best Chinese silk jacket over an American dress, her jade hairpin gleaming against her dark hair. She waited on the porch as their carriage approached, James solid and steady beside her. Theodore McKinnon stepped down first, tall and grey-haired, his Boston propriety intact despite the dusty journey. He looked at the ranch with critical eyes until his gaze fell on the hands working the near pasture, their movements swift and sure as they directed cattle using Clara and James's signs. "What are they doing?" he demanded through his wife, who translated into signs. Clara stepped forward before James could respond. In clear, careful signs that Mrs. McKinnon translated back, she explained their communication system, demonstrating how it blended ranch practicality with Chinese precision. And James's original signs. "Efficiency has improved 30%, she signed, then pointed to the ledgers she'd brought out to the porch. "The books show every detail." Theodore McKinnon was, above all else, a banker. He couldn't resist looking at the ledgers. Clara held her breath as he flipped through pages of increasing profits and expanding contracts, including the new deal with the Crow Nation that had more than replaced Peterson's lost business. Finally, he looked up at his son. "You did this?" "We did this," James signed, taking Clara's hand. "Together." Clara pulled away gently and walked to the family Bible she'd left open on the porch table. With steady hands, she signed the story of every McKinnon marriage recorded there, showing how she'd learned their history, their traditions. Then she added new signs, ones that spoke of building bridges between cultures, of finding strength in difference, of creating harmony from silence. When she finished, Mrs. McKinnon was crying, and even Theodore's stern face had softened. He looked again at the efficient operation around him, built by the son he'd underestimated and the woman who'd helped him expand his vision even further. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward and opened the Bible to its record of marriages. "Show me," he said, speaking directly to Clara for the first time, "how to write your name in Chinese characters." Clara first saw the quilt at one of Mrs. Sullivan's weekly sewing circles, which she'd finally been persuaded to attend. The women of Thornwood had been working on it in secret for months, a wedding gift that brought tears to her eyes when they unfolded it. Each square told a story. Here was the ranch gate, where she and James had first truly connected, rendered in careful stitches. There were their communication cards, recreated in fabric and thread. The Chinese characters for love and strength were embroidered alongside ranch signs for the same words, the designs flowing together as naturally as their own blended language. "Mrs. Chen helped us with the Chinese patterns," Mary Wilson explained, her hands moving in the basic signs she'd learned. "And Martha showed us how to stitch the ranch signals properly." Clara touched the square that showed a broken washboard transformed into a bridge, marveling at how something that had once seemed like disaster had become part of their love story. Even Mr. Peterson's wife had contributed, creating an intricate design that incorporated cattle brands and Chinese good luck symbols. "We wanted to show," Mrs. Sullivan said, her own signs growing more confident with practice, "that Thornwood understands now. What you and James have built, it's changed more than just the ranch." She was right. Clara saw it everywhere now. Children in the street practicing signs they'd learned, store owners posting illustrated cards for basic transactions, even the church choir experimenting with gesture to enhance their hymns. What had begun as a private language between two souls had blossomed into something that enriched the entire community. The transformation went deeper than just communication. Clara found herself speaking more, her whispered voice growing stronger with practice and acceptance. Not that she needed to speak much. Her hands could shape stories that drew children in clusters around her porch, their small fingers mimicking her movements as she taught them to sign simple tales. James's parents noticed the change too. Theodore McKinnon, initially skeptical, now spent hours with Clara in the study, learning how Chinese characters could be adapted into signs that made business negotiations clearer across language barriers. He'd even started corresponding with merchants in San Francisco about implementing similar systems. "You've created something remarkable," he told her one evening, his signs still clumsy but determined. "Not just a language, but a whole new way of seeing." Mrs. McKinnon went further, working with Clara to develop signs for music that could be taught in schools. "Every child should know there are many ways to hear a song," she said, her hands dancing through the gestures they'd created together. The ranch hands took particular pride in their role as pioneers of this new language. Tom, the foreman, loved telling visitors how their system had spread to other ranches, making cattle drives safer and more efficient across the territory. "Soon everyone will be using McKinnon signs," he boasted, demonstrating the fluid movements that had become second nature. Clara recorded it all in her journal, no longer writing only in Chinese, but weaving English words through her entries, just as she wove different languages of gesture into her daily life. She wrote about teaching Mrs. Sullivan's new boarders to sign, about William's daughters learning Chinese characters, about Martha's proud mastery of both. The quilt grew as more women added squares, each piece reflecting how Clara and James's story had touched their own lives. There was the schoolhouse where children now learned signs alongside their letters, the church where the pastor had asked Clara to teach him to sign his sermons, the general store with its communication cards proudly displayed. One evening, as Clara sat with the quilt spread across her lap, James found her tracing the square that showed two pairs of hands reaching toward each other across a divide that grew smaller with each stitch. "Remember when I first arrived?" She signed, her movements flowing with the confidence she'd gained. How quiet everything seemed. James smiled and settled beside her, his hands joining hers on the quilt. Not quiet, he corrected, just waiting for the right song. Clara leaned against him, remembering the frightened young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach believing her silence was a curse. How could she have known it would become a gift instead? That her whispered voice would find its strength not in volume, but in the poetry of motion. The quilt would hang in their home after the wedding, a testament to how love could transform. Not just two people, but an entire community. Each square showed a piece of their journey, but more than that, it showed the journey of a town learning that communication lived in more than just words, that understanding could bridge any gulf, that sometimes the most powerful songs were the ones you couldn't hear at all. The morning of the wedding, Clara stood before her mirror, watching Martha and Mrs. Chen work together to dress her. The ceremony items laid out on her bed told the story of two worlds joining as one. Her mother's red silk wedding jacket beside, a Western white dress, James's grandmother's lace veil next to Clara's jade hairpin, a Christian Bible alongside traditional Chinese tea ceremony implements. "Something old," Mrs. Sullivan announced from the doorway, holding up a string of pearls that had belonged to James's grandmother. "Something new," Martha added, presenting a pair of silver combs crafted by the local silversmith, their design incorporating both Chinese characters and ranch signs. Mrs. Chen stepped forward with a blue silk ribbon to tie back Clara's hair, and Mrs. McKinnon completed the tradition with a borrowed lace handkerchief. 4 women from different worlds, working together to prepare a bride who had helped them all find a common language. Outside, the ranch hummed with activity. The hands had transformed the main corral into a wedding venue, stringing paper lanterns from Shanghai alongside Western bunting. The crow traders who had become their business partners had brought gifts of intricately beaded ceremonial items, adding another layer to the cultural tapestry. James waited at the edge of the property, refusing to peek as tradition demanded. His father stood beside him, both men's hands moving in excited conversation. Theodore's signs still imperfect, but enthusiastic, as he practiced the Chinese blessing he'd insisted on learning for the ceremony. The wedding itself was a dance of languages. The pastor spoke the traditional words, while Martha signed them. Clara and James exchanged vows in their unique blend of signs, their hands telling their love story with gestures that flowed like poetry. Then Clara's whispered, "I do," joined James's spoken words, neither voice stronger than the other, both equally beautiful in their own way. For the Chinese tea ceremony that followed, they modified tradition. Instead of spoken blessings, the elders of both families offered their good wishes in sign, each gesture carrying the weight of acceptance and hope. Mrs. Chen cried openly as Clara and James served her tea, her hands forming the Chinese characters for daughter and joy. The celebration brought together every element of their lives. Ranch hands demonstrated their signing skills to amazed Boston relatives. Mrs. Sullivan's boarders practiced Chinese phrases with James's cousins. Children darted between tables, their hands flying in a pigeon of signs they'd created themselves, making up their own language as Clara and James had done. At the feast, dishes from both cultures shared space on tables decorated with wildflowers from the northern pasture. William had insisted on providing the beef, while Mrs. Chen's community contributed traditional Chinese delicacies. The crow traders added their own specialties, creating a meal that, like the couple it honored, proved that harmony could be found in unexpected combinations. The dancing began as the sun set, and here too worlds merged. Clara had taught the women of Thornwood the elegant movements of Chinese traditional dance, while James's family demonstrated proper Boston reels.
Blending together beneath strings of lights and paper lanterns, a thermos. This was one that hadn't been planned.
Together in their own way, their hands weaving the story of their love in signs that incorporated every language they knew. Chinese characters flowed into ranch signals, Boston propriety melted into Western practicality, and all of it came together. In a dance that needed no sound to sing its joy. Martha later said she'd never seen anything more eloquent than their first dance as husband and wife. Two people who had taken what others saw as limitations and created something limitless instead. As night fell, the ranch hands surprised everyone with a new sign they'd created just for the occasion. One by one, they raised their hands to the star-filled sky, fingers spelling out a blessing that combined Chinese luck symbols with cattle brands and ranch signs. The gesture spread through the crowd like a wave. Boston bankers and Chinese merchants, frontier women and native traders, all raising their hands in a silent chorus of celebration. Clara and James stood in the center of it all, their hands linked, their hearts beating in time to a music that didn't need to be heard to be felt. Above them, paper lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, their light mixing with the stars to illuminate a scene no one in Thornwood would ever forget. The moment when two souls proved that love's true language lived in the heart, not the ears or voice. 1 year after the wedding, James and Clara stood before their ranch's new entrance sign. The carved wooden board bore the ranch's name in 3 forms: English letters, Chinese characters, and the hand signs they'd created, each representation carved deep and painted in gold. Below, smaller letters announced, "All languages welcome here." The sign had become something of a landmark. Traders regularly detoured to the Flying M to learn the new communication methods that were making commerce easier across cultural barriers. The Crow Nation had adopted many of their signs, blending them with their own traditional gestures. Even the railroad surveyors had taken notice, recommending their system for coordinating work crews of different nationalities. "Did you ever imagine this?" Clara signed to James as they watched another group of visitors arriving, their wagon loaded with goods from San Francisco's Chinese merchants. James smiled and shook his head. In the year since their wedding, their ranch had become more than just a cattle operation. It was now a place where people came to learn, to bridge divides, to find new ways of understanding each other. The changes were evident everywhere. The bunkhouse now hosted regular evening classes where ranch hands taught signing to newcomers. The old barn had been converted into a meeting hall where Clara conducted lessons in Chinese culture and language. Even the cooking fires saw different cultures mixing as Chinese spices flavored Western stews and frontier techniques transformed traditional dishes. Theodore McKinnon's banking connections had spread word of their success back east. Last month's Boston Globe had run a feature on their innovative communication methods, leading to a flood of letters from deaf schools and international businesses interested in their techniques. Clara's mother had finally visited, arriving with the latest group of merchants. She'd wept at the sight of her daughter confidently directing ranch operations, her hands dancing through commands that everyone understood. Now she sat on the porch most evenings, learning to sign while teaching anyone who was interested about Chinese tea ceremonies and silk painting. The ranch's ledgers told the story in numbers. Profits had doubled as their reputation for cross-cultural trade grew. But the real measure of their success was in less tangible things. The way children from town played games using mixed signs. How the church service now incorporated gestures that made its message accessible to everyone. How traders from different lands could meet and deal fairly without sharing a spoken language. Clara touched the Chinese characters on the sign, remembering the frightened young woman who had arrived in Thornwood, believing her quiet nature was a flaw. That woman could never have imagined that her silence would help build bridges between worlds. "Look," James signed, directing her attention to the approaching wagon. A young couple sat in the front, the woman Chinese, the man clearly a rancher from his dress. They were both already using basic signs they must have learned in town. Clara stepped forward to greet them, her hands flowing through welcome gestures that needed no translation. The woman's face lit up with relief as she responded with a mixture of Chinese courtesy and Western signs. "They're from Montana," James explained after reading the man's introduction. "Want to learn our methods for their own ranch. Says they saw the article in the newspaper." That evening, as they added another entry to the ranch's visitor ledger, Clara reflected on how far they'd come. The book was filled with names from across the territory and beyond: Boston merchants, Chinese traders, native leaders, frontier families. Each had come seeking something different, but all had left with the same gift, the knowledge that understanding could bridge any divide. Martha brought them tea, her movements as graceful as any Chinese servant as she performed the ceremony. Clara had taught her. "3 more families arriving tomorrow," she signed. "Word keeps spreading." James nodded, adding his own observation. "Soon we'll need a bigger meeting hall." Clara smiled, remembering Mrs. Sullivan's words from long ago. The West needs strong women. She hadn't understood then that strength could come in many forms, that sometimes the quietest voice could carry the furthest. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the signs gold letters in deeper hues. From the bunkhouse came the sound of laughter as another evening class began, hands moving in the gathering darkness, shaping understanding word by word, gesture by gesture. Clara's journal entry that night was brief but telling. "Today I watched a Chinese merchant and a Boston banker conduct an entire trade deal in our signs. Neither spoke a word of the other's language, yet they understood each other perfectly. This is what we built here, not just a ranch, but a place where silence can speak louder than words, where differences become strengths, where every gesture carries the power to connect hearts across any distance." The family portrait hung in the ranch house study, a testament to how much could change in 2 years. Clara stood beside James, her jade hairpin catching the photographer's light, her hands positioned to sign "love" in their unique blended language. James's parents stood behind them, their own hands forming Chinese characters for family. Martha and Mrs. Chen flanked them, each wearing clothes that borrowed from both cultures. Even the ranch hands had insisted on being included, arranged, in rows with their hands spelling out Flying M in 3 different sign languages. But what caught most visitors' attention was Clara's expression. Gone was the timid young woman who had stepped off that stagecoach. In her place was someone who had found her true voice, in silence. "Tell me the story again," signed Sarah, William's youngest daughter, who now spent more time at the Flying M than at her own ranch. She sat at Clara's feet, practicing her signs as Clara prepared for the day's lessons. Clara's hands moved through the familiar tale: the lonely bride, the deaf rancher, the broken washboard that had built a bridge between worlds. Sarah followed along, adding the gestures she knew, her small fingers growing more confident with each retelling. Through the window, Clara could see new visitors arriving, a group from California this time, including a deaf teacher and her Chinese merchant husband. They had read about the Flying M's methods in a San Francisco newspaper and had traveled all this way to learn. James appeared in the doorway, his presence still sending a flutter through Clara's heart. "Ready for today's class?" he signed. Clara nodded, gathering her teaching materials. They had expanded beyond simple communication cards now. Their students learned not just signs, but understanding, how to see beyond differences, how to find common ground in seeming opposites, how to hear the songs that didn't need sound to touch the soul. As they walked to the meeting hall together, Clara remembered the article that had first brought her to Thornwood. Mail order bride, dismissed for being too quiet. How strange that seeming failure had led her here, to this place where silence had become her greatest strength. The hall was full today. Traders from 3 territories sat beside local ranchers. A group of Crow warriors practiced signs with Boston merchants. Chinese immigrants and frontier settlers compared notes on their shared gestures. And there, in the back, Clara spotted a young woman with downcast eyes and trembling hands. Someone else who needed to learn that her quiet nature could become her power. That evening, as the ranch settled into its familiar rhythms, Clara added a final entry to her journal. She wrote in 3 languages now, Chinese characters flowing into English words, accompanied by sketches of the signs that had become as natural as breathing. 2 years ago, I thought silence was a prison, she wrote. Now I know it was always a door, waiting to be opened. Through it, I found not just love, but a way to help others find their own voices, spoken or unspoken. James and I have built more than a ranch here. We've built a place where silence can sing, where differences become harmonies, where every hand can tell a story. She looked up at the family portrait, at all the faces and hands that had become part of their expanded family. Outside, the sunset painted Thornwood's mountains in shades of gold and purple. From the bunkhouse came the familiar sounds of evening, a gathering, hands moving in conversation that needed no voice to be heard. James joined her in the study, his fingers intertwining with hers to form the sign they had created together, one that meant both ending and beginning, because in their experience, every ending just opened the door to something new. Clara smiled, remembering the frightened bride who had once barely dared to whisper. That whisper had become a song, carried not on the wind, but in the elegant dance of hands across the distance, building bridges between hearts, between cultures, between worlds. In the growing darkness, their hands moved together, speaking the language of love they had created, adding one more quiet note to the endless symphony of understanding.